Hi, my name's Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Insight is a show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes historical books that provide an insight into the present, sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books that can help to put politics into a broader setting. I suspect that's what we're doing with today's book. It's written by a woman named Deborah Giggs, and her book is titled Fugitive Spring, Coming of Age in the 50s and 60s. Now, joining me on the show today are two Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Jacob Bauer, and to Jacob's right is Kyle Kisner. I wanted to read an opening quote, and then we could jump into a discussion about the book. The author writes, "I wish that my mother could see what I saw while in a glider over Laguna Beach, California. All families have their own peculiar talents. Mine has always been good at big send-offs, no matter what the crisis has been or its outcome. I still have dreams, like all-night parties crowded with brothers and sisters. We're all in the kitchen, pots and pans knocking in the sink. Or we're piling in the car on our way somewhere, where one of us inevitably will be left, missed halfway home, turned around for, retrieved and celebrated, dreams from which I wake alone in Seattle or Iowa City or London or Washington or Boston, happy it's not the past."
I think that just goes to show like her character. She kind of just glides through life. That's just who she is. She kind of is like a free spirit. She doesn't really belong in any of those places or really like with her family. She still like loves her family and like loves those memories, but she just kind of felt like she didn't belong where she was in that like kind of mold.
Yeah, indoctrination and ritual and a heavy religious background is pretty well suited for what seems to be a slightly narrow worldview for her family, where the Bible sort of just explains what's required. Life in Jeff City, there's an interesting mix, as you see in other parts of Missouri, between suburban, urban, and rural living, and sort of an uneasy marriage between science and religion going along. In fact, her brother, being the most educated person in the community, is suddenly deemed to be eligible as being the pastor, and that's his sole
Yeah, here, well, we're talking about Jefferson City, Missouri, so this is where she's growing. Her father is a physician, but I was trying to figure this out, because at the beginning of the book she's talking about her father doing all these experiments on rats to test for cancer, so I'm thinking he's a research scientist, but in the book, she's presenting him as sort of a hometown, homespun doctor. She uses the term that doctors at this time are seasonal employees or employers, and he sort of seems to have a practice that comes and goes. He's not always being paid. He's being paid through a barter system, so sometimes he's getting animals for payment. But then again, we're back to trying to figure out, is he a major research scientist? So I was having this problem of trying to figure some of this out, and then I guess at times the family takes in strangers that are going through town to live out in an outhouse or a back house or a barn that's somewhere in the backyard. And so, yeah, the family is sort of, I think, broader than the religious overtones of the book. There seems to be some broader element of something going on.
Yeah, I mean, like with like the rats, he was kind of like specialized in cancer.
That's what his clinic kind of like specialized in. So I guess he was studying like different treatments like on the rats. But with it being seasonal, I mean, the clinic was year-round. But I think with Missourians, like it's just it's convenient for us, we go, and for them it was during the summer, which is when he had his busy hours, which is why he had his like children help him over the summer. So
the prison, I should just point out the term Fugitive Spring. So there's two prisons near her. One is a women's prisons that's on the outskirts of town, and then the other one is there's a larger men's facility in Jefferson City. So I assume that Fugitive is coming because in one situation a prisoner escapes, and so this is how I guess the prison permeates her childhood around her, and so as a result this is how the terminology comes from.
I mean, I think that is kind of like prevalent throughout the whole book, because I mean, even the convent, she kind of sees that as a prison as well, like the nuns that are kind of like stuck there, but like by their own like choice. So we see those, the prisons, like the one fugitive that does hide out in their orchard, her mother as one, and then even her sisters and herself, kind of just that she feels kind of in prison where they are, and like they kind of just escape and they're fugitives. So.
There's a definitely, you see throughout the book, in the beginning of the book, she sort of identifies these prisoners as being, they're just like migrant workers to her. And you pointed out that there was a men and a women's prison. I thought it was an interesting dynamic to, there's many references to religion in the book. There's a pretty interesting dynamic to the fact that there is an ascribed way to which women were supposed to be, and they describe them, you know, these are dainty maidens who are patiently waiting to be nurturing, loving, supporting mothers and wives. Then they go to the women's prison to deliver flowers, and the girls can't figure out how are these women prisoners if they're these dainty, loving, supportive people.
Yeah, the quote she had on that is, in our experience, women were, without exception, young or old, rich or poor, given in one way or another to the care and nurturing of children. They were wives and mothers or widows with grown children, or grandmothers, or what our fathers called maiden ladies, who were our school and Sunday school teachers. Even the nuns figured in our strictly maternal perceptions. And so you end up seeing, this seems to be sort of her grounding. If she's going to move on, it's from, she has to break herself out of how she's seen this perception of how she looks at being feminine, I guess, or female. I'm not quite sure how you want to put this.
The culture of the 50s, that home economics and like what they were teaching as the role of women, and how, you know, they should, in school, like what they were learning just to be wives and mothers, and that was what was expected of them. And, you know, she repeatedly said, like, she kind of just failed at that, like, in there, and that's kind of like foreshadowing that that's not what she was going to be able to do with her life, and that's not what she wanted to do with her life.
Right, and it's not just that they're expected to be women and mothers, it's that their value, the entire value of them as people is attached to their ability to do that. You see in the book, there's a group of, there is, I believe, a widowed lady with 2 daughters that aren't married, and her mom kind of just shakes her head and says, you know, they're all alone, what are they going to ever be able to do? So she constantly gives them charity and helps them out with things, because she feels bad for them, these poor girls being out to fend for themselves, and she doesn't want that for her daughters. And as we see her idea of being a woman, being feminine, changes, often as it does, as she pursues more education and is exposed to more diverse ways of living. She becomes friends with Susan in her dorms, and Susan is very much, she smokes and she plays guitar and she goes to these clubs, and those aren't things that women were supposed to do where the author was from.
Yeah. Yeah, the home economics, just to return, I was thinking of that because my sister took home economics in high school, and it was like, I remember my mother being very pleased that she could learn home economics, and in hindsight I used to think about, you know, what, because she's learning how to clean the kitchen, I gather, and a little baking and a little bit about how to run it, and you think of it as sort of some sort of skills, and I'm thinking, okay, so what was the big deal here? But
yeah.
And she's sort of, I think, in that sort of situation where it's sort of being taught as, she's almost ridiculing the term economics associated with the word home, and going, and I can't quite do this stuff, I'm not that excited about it. I don't think it's like she can't do it, it's just she doesn't want to put herself wholeheartedly into doing it.
Yeah, because she was being like tested on how to organize a drawer of utensils, and like she kept failing it, but I think that's just because like she said she couldn't remember it, but she was just saying that that's not how it is, because at her home she talked about how like jumbled the drawer was, and that's more realistic. And like all the different things that were in the drawer is not just neat utensils. So.
When you bring up her friend, and that her friend is sort of pulling her as she goes off to college. Well, she flunks out of a college in Missouri. You know, I'm thinking here she is, she becomes a well-known writer. She subsequently kills herself, which I had to go and take a look at, because then I was looking and thinking, well, maybe might use one of her other books down the road. And so I was reading about another book she wrote about a very difficult time raising a troubled child that she had and how to try to reach him. So what happens is that this friend, I think, is starting to pull her out. But it's apparent that her family dynamics have affected her through her life.
Right. She actually makes reference to that when she meets her first husband, Charlie, and she says that even after the divorce, her parents, they almost seem kind of disappointed that she broke off that first marriage, and they're constantly, she implies that they're urging them to get back together all the time. And she almost paints the idea of how you become a woman and where you find your place in this world in sort of a Kafkaesque manner, that there's this set of sort of rules that are unwritten, but they're out there and everyone knows them, and that's kind of what home economics does. But then she talks about when she was pregnant and having her first child, the nurse didn't exactly communicate with her. She just sort of knew that these were the times when you're supposed to be checking up on her, and the rest of the time she's sitting there knitting and watching her game shows or what have you on the TV, and she's trying to figure it out the whole time against what she feels personally.
Yeah, there was a moment where I was thinking how she saw women, that her father had a nurse, and the father's nurse was a very good one, and she helped out occasionally, like her sisters, at her father's office during the summer. And the nurse gets married, so now the father is concerned that now that the nurse got married, that means she has to leave because her husband's going to want her to leave and not work. And so the woman is saying, but I don't want to leave. I want to stay. I like my job. I like what I'm doing. I'm a nurse. I feel like I'm doing something of a profession. And you get this feeling, there's this sort of a tug of war that she can see occurring within the nurse.
Right. The nurse actually mentioned she says, if I just was to walk away from this, what would that say about the 3 years I spent in nursing school? And you know, her husband probably necessarily didn't have as much schooling as she did to become a nurse, yet whether or not she can continue doing what she loves is completely hinged on whether or not he believes it's okay for her to keep doing it. So again, you see this as a common theme in the pre-civil rights and feminism movement. You see women not having a choice. They don't have their own. They're almost not like sovereign individuals. They're a sovereign entity of their husband's will.
And the husband, I mean, she did repeat that the husband was saying she could work as long as she wanted. And I mean, but unfortunately, like after she had her second child, she did state that she did end up leaving the clinic to be like a home mother. But I think that also goes to show like Debbie's father, because I mean, he let her mother work, ran with the disabled children in the clinic.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the reference to disabled, or I think she used the term handicapped children, there was this odd reference, and she quickly moved on, how you have a handicapped child and then we ship them somewhere. And it was like, I went back and I was trying to find this thing about, well, they shouldn't be taken care of somehow at the home, they're shipped somewhere.
Yeah,
I don't know what
mental
happened to
institute
them.
that said, yeah.
They really viewed things like that completely differently, and almost in a sense, the logic doesn't exactly translate. You look at the teachings and many of the stories that she's told throughout her childhood, and it seems to preach, you know, sort of equal love and acceptance of all God's creatures, but then where's that same acceptance regarding these handicapped children? You don't necessarily see that. They're just kind of, you know, like you said, ship them off and, you know, forget about them, really.
One of the ways she sort of creates an image of the world changing around her is, I gather, when they moved to Jefferson City, the image is quite rural. But then she's talking about subdivisions being built, and now suddenly rural land is disappearing as subdivisions are appearing where previously there were farms. And so suddenly now and she's talking about a highway going through that wasn't there before. And so as a result, it's sort of like there's change around her before she subsequently heads off to college.
And that just goes because how much the country was changing at the time, and like she said, there was so much rural area, all the woods and the orchards around them, and then suddenly that was all bulldozed and like torn down just to build up like houses and like suburbs, and like they even made an offer on the orchard, and the father like refused, and yeah, so.
They're also clearing land too to build fallout shelters, because she makes the reference that they had a lot of things in their own community they were worried about. They had the escaped prisoners. People were worried about things like, are my kids going to be okay and get married off, and are they going to learn everything they need to in Bible school? Meanwhile, you have Nikita Khrushchev making his big speech before the UN, talking about how we will bury you. And then she points out, I thought this was very interesting, she points out how he uses the word you, and then of course when they're in their biblical studies, they know that the you Jesus is talking about, she knows it's the 24 disciples, but of course they apply it broadly to mean the entire congregation. Subsequently, Khrushchev's speech was referring to you as in the Western world, United States, but they applied it more specifically to themselves to sort of build that sense of fear that there's things they need to be worried about outside just their immediate little area.
Yeah, that fear permeates, because she's saying, as a child, which I remember, that the fear that nuclear war could occur at any moment, and you had enough science fiction movies made that created that sort of impression. And fallout shelter, that was interesting, that suddenly that she's aware of the building of a fallout shelter. I remember it vaguely because she would be in my age range, but I don't remember seeing a fallout. I never remember seeing one, but she sees one. So I was thinking that's sort of odd. In the middle of the country, suddenly, I guess, Jefferson City is a target for the then Soviet Union to send a nuclear missile, but she sees a fallout shelter, where I never saw one in New York City.
Well, yeah, her father built one in the backyard, basically. Yeah. So, but I think what's most interesting about that is kind of just like she said, like it looked like a grave, but it wasn't. It wasn't even like as respectable as a grave. I think that just goes to show like what she really thought of that and how like her impression of that time and the fear of it.
It's interesting, too, that, as you point out, I felt it was sort of a dark foreshadowing almost, that she said it looked like a grave, and then later on she goes by it and it's got all kinds of overgrowth on it, and it's basically forgotten about for something that was such a huge deal at one point in time. Yeah. So that was a pretty interesting thing to read, for me at least.
Yeah, I mean, he bulldozed over, like, gardens and orchards to build that. And just kind of show like they ruined something so beautiful and good, and that she like cherished for that.
I get the feeling at times, though, there is a dysfunctional family life. If her sister elopes in the middle of the night, and I don't know why, but I couldn't quite find her anymore in the book. Yeah. I don't know whether she had a happy marriage or what went on, because there's no reference later to her. It's sort of like she's not there.
Yeah, because I mean later she just says like I missed Ava, but she doesn't actually really say like whatever happened to her. But I mean that also her other sister Gina, like she kind of did her own thing and separated from like what her parents wanted. She like built her own room in the house and then went off on her own, got her own apartment, went to the school that she wanted to go to instead of the school her father wanted her to go to. So, and I think that was kind of like foreshadowing for that. Debbie, she didn't want to follow the path either. She kind of wanted to do her own thing.
And she expresses in the aftermath, she does express briefly the aftermath of her sister leaving, how she came to become addicted to opioids and phenobarbital and things of that nature because it helped ease her feelings. And I felt like that was almost subtextual, that it underscored a problem you began to see emerging in the 60s that is paralleled with something you're seeing today, and as people were becoming increasingly addicted to prescription drugs that were just handed out part and parcel like candy back then. And she actually makes reference to that a couple of times, like, hey, once I started seeing this guy, Ray, who, again, that was against what her family wanted her to do, that eased her anxiety a little bit, and she was able to kind of push herself away from that habit.
When she gets married and her husband is preparing and learning how to become a pilot, so he's walking around with his uniform on. So you're in the Vietnam War era, and so she's referring to, for example, being on the University of Missouri Columbia campus, and that students are yelling, screaming, and I think she says even spitting at the cadets or ROTC students that are walking around in uniforms. I don't get the feeling she's necessarily protesting the war. It's because her husband's part of the military, but it sort of permeates her for a number of years there.
And with those protests, she kind of just like wanders through them. She doesn't really join the protesters, but she doesn't like join the movement that supports the war either, or the military. She kind of just is there, and she really doesn't know, like, because she helps both the protesters and then also the ROTC, so she's kind of just confused.
Yeah, I got that feeling. It was like she was sitting on the fence. She didn't want to be one side or the other, and she was sort of just trying to be there.
Yeah, she sort of makes reference to, she talks about Walter Cronkite, who oftentimes is viewed in that era as being sort of the voice of a generation. And he was the one who reported on JFK's assassination, reported on Dr. King's assassination, reported on RFK, and did a lot of the reporting around the Vietnam War, including the violent protests that erupted from that, for instance, at the campus in Berkeley, California. And she makes reference to that ROTC, to this protest. She says, well, it didn't get violent like the way Berkeley got, but it definitely got rowdy.
She has this quote regarding women that I thought says, once it had been a terrible thing to have gotten breasts. And so it was sort of the way you end up looking at this. I know, I was just thinking how that you would even concern yourself and start to feel that way. And yet that was true when the Mickey Mouse Club was on the air in this period. Annette Funicello is sort of a member of this, and as she gets breasts on television, this was talk of school. You know, today you'd not think about it, but this was sort of how you would look at a girl becoming, say, a woman. And so to reflect on that and realize as I was reading that, because this is where my mind wandered at that moment when I read that sentence. So yeah, that's how she's struggling with how you're developing.
Yeah, I mean, again, her identity, because I mean, she goes on about how like she played with the boys, she acted like a boy, like she did all those kind of things. She wasn't expected to do like the roles of like women until she suddenly started like developing, and then suddenly was put in those classes and stuff, and she just felt like she never belonged there. She kind of like, even later when she was married with the other like military wives, she didn't really feel like she was a military wife or like compared to them. So
I kind of feel like in much of the book you see, just as Jacob's alluding to here, that she sort of goes through the motions. She knows what's expected of her, and she sort of just kind of goes along with it the whole time, though mumbling under her breath, complete disdain for it. You see when she first goes to William Jewell, all her classmates they're Bible toting and they're going to chapel and things of that. And she says that she doesn't have the same kind of enthusiasm for all those things that they have, and they kind of frown upon her for that.
Yeah, I don't really ever see rebellion in her throughout this book. It's more like she sort of, you're almost feeling like she's saying, I didn't have the right grounding to be able to know how to help myself develop through life. Certainly, and one day her marriage just fizzles out. And so you got a feeling it wasn't going to go well. She made some quick reference, and then suddenly she's in Boston. And across the country somewhere. And it's sort of this drifting through life.
yeah, I mean, like I said, with the ending quote, with her just riding the glider, she kind of just likes where it goes. She doesn't need to, like, she doesn't want him to start the plane and, like, take them back to the airfield. She kind of just wants to glide for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And, like, when she escaped, or kind of, like, ran away from the church and didn't go to the classes, she would say she would just drive, and then eventually would turn around and make it back in time, so her parents didn't know she was gone. I think that's just, once again, her character. She just didn't really feel like she belonged anywhere. She kind of just wanted to move and, like, find her own place.
I had it's unfortunate to hear that she has since killed herself, because I had a kind of a more positive outlook on that final quote, and not just her life experiences has her perspective changed, but literally, in that sense, her perspective's changed, and she wishes she could put that same sort of enlightenment into her mother as well.
Well, it was that, because I'm looking at the book published in 1991, so then I was wondering, I wonder what happened to her, so that's how I went online to check that out. We only have a few moments left. What do you think of the book?
I thought it was a really good book. I mean, I can kind of relate to it, like, growing up in Missouri my whole life. You kind of just, some of the similarities of your, like, childhood with her. But I thought it was a very good book, and kind of gave a atmosphere of the culture of the time.
I felt, too, I'm in agreement with that. I felt it was a pretty good peek into what life was like, not just in the 1950s, but in particular for women. And many of the things that she brings up, such as being disappointed at development, those aren't things that I necessarily can relate to as a boy, but as Jacob said, growing up in Missouri, there is things such as living in a suburban, urban area, but then being right there on the edge of the countryside. That plus the tumultuousness of the time that she's seeing, I see some parallels in this book between what was going on then and what's going on today.
Yeah, I liked the book, and as I read it, I kept thinking of my sister, and that, realizing we're in her age range, and so as a result of going to high school was the home economics chapter that hit me, and I thought I remember walking by where home economics was located in the high school, that you're actually looking at a kitchen, and there's my sister in there, and vaguely I remember seeing her in an apron. And so I was thinking, yeah, this was true, that there is a lot in this book so I probably am going to tell my sister, I think here's a good book you might want to read about your childhood. So I just want to thank you for joining us today, and I think we all suggest that it would be a good book to read.